Welcome to the History Slam podcast from Activehistory.ca. Here's your host, Sean Graham.
Thank you, Adam. Welcome to the History Slam, everybody. I am Sean Graham, coming at you today nearly live from Ottawa, Ontario, on the campus of Carleton University, where my night class just ended, but I was so excited to talk to our guest that I'm pulling a late night shift, as is he, coming at us here from Waterloo. Dan Heidt, welcome to the show.
Hello.
Very glad to have you with us today to talk about your new book, which you edited, which is entitled Reconsidering Confederation, Canada's Founding Debates 1864 to 1999. Now, I'm sure a lot of people will hear the years on that title of 1864 to 1999 when you're talking about the Confederation Debates and be curious about that. But before we get too deep of a dive into that, we were just talking before we started to record that this book, as an edited collection, is based off of your larger Confederation Debates project, which, you know, with the 150 happening last year, obviously a lot of attention was paid to Confederation. And I'm just curious for you, where is that project coming from, and what is the larger scope of the project from which this book is born?
Yeah, and thank you for having me on today. So the Confederation Debates project, as opposed to Reconsidering Confederation, the book, began with an editorial that actually I didn't write. Jeffrey Kello did at Carleton. He wrote an editorial in the National Post in February of 2015, kind of bemoaning the fact that Canadians, unlike Americans or Europeans, don't really have access to their country's founding debates. Most of our records, as of a couple of years ago, still largely lay on microfilm, a couple of edited collections. In some cases, say New Brunswick's case, it was really only these edited collections where you could get little snippets of information about what your province's views were on joining this thing called Canada, you know, as it was slowly growing in the 1860s. And I kind of thought he had a point. And I had a pretty good background in digitizing records. I was also finishing up my doctorate on Ontario federalism at the time, so I was pretty familiar with the records that would be involved for most of the provinces, and I had the technical skill set. So I was lucky enough to be working on a postdoc at the time and had a little spare time. So I started to build this project up. I was lucky enough to early on meet with Whitney Lackenbauer over at St. Jerome's, Professor Marcel Martel at York, John English, and gradually the project grew as more and more historians got on board with it. We were able to get this critical mass of energy and funding to actually try to bring these records to Canadians in as close to their entirety as we could manage. So we went to the archives, we got these records, we got them scanned, we partnered with Conestoga College to then build a transcription portal. And we were actually able to ended up being close to 9,000 pages of text on this portal. And we crowdsourced the transcription of it, which was really exciting. I got to meet Canadians from across the country who got engaged with these records, wanting to know more about their province's history or other provinces' histories, which was really neat. Everyone from high school students wanting to learn more to our oldest volunteer was 93.
Wow.
She was one of our largest contributors. She was fantastic. She loved Canadian political history and really got into it, and everybody did fantastic work. So the purpose of the project, though, long story to saying, the purpose was to popularize these records, to make them accessible to Canadians. And we wanted from the outset for that to be more than just providing a wall of 9,000 pages of text on a website. Right. So from a very early stage, I was lucky enough to meet with graduate students from across the country in the end, who were very keen on helping us parse chunks of these records into more accessible bits for different age groups and walks of life, Canadians in different walks of life. So we ended up creating quotes of the day. We did 365 of these that well over half of them were found by these transcribers who looked at a page, found something interesting, clicked a button on our interface, and reported the quote. and we were able to post these to Twitter, to Instagram, to Facebook, and they got quite a following on social media. Similarly, we made lesson plans targeting grade 7 and 8 classes, one for every province across the country. We also made a high school lesson plan that kind of amalgamated them, and it created mock debates where students were introduced to roughly equal numbers of pro and anti-Confederation figures from their province, and were given primary documents or little snippets of their speeches of key kind of centralized points around minority rights, majority rule, kind of timeless questions like that, to understand why their province, people in their province, were for or against joining. But the other part of the project that was quite unique, I think, is we were coming out, right around Canada 150, just before Canada 150, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report was coming out. And we felt very strongly that we wanted to bring Indigenous voices into the Confederation story and really help Canadians to understand that Confederation isn't just about the British North America Act. It's about these founding treaties and the negotiation of those treaties as well, the written as well as the oral agreements that were made. So we brought the numbered treaties on in the case of the Confederation Debates, and had those transcribed as well as some records of their negotiation. For example, Alexander Morris's written account. We had that fully transcribed, and it appears on the Legacy website. All of this is available on the Legacy website, which is at hcmc.uvic.ca/Confederation. All of these records are there. They're all searchable. You can browse them in a map interface. We were able to do a lot of really cool things with the records.
Yeah, so it seems like it's a project then to, as you say, take the documents and make them accessible. It's remarkable to me as someone who does not study the Confederation period to think that those documents weren't really accessible before this. How is that really possible? And what sort of steps did you have to take to digitize them? Because this strikes me, living in Ottawa, understanding the bureaucracy of this town and the archives as an institution, what sort of process was it in terms of even just getting the rights to be able to digitize?
We were really lucky. The Canada 150 was a time where Canadians were thinking reflectively. Some work had been done to digitize some of these records. Early Canadiana had digitized a small portion of them. Google had digitized some of the newspaper Hansards. So newspapermen's shorthanded versions, recordings of what was said in parliaments, which in some cases is all we have. Google had digitized these newspaper records. In other cases, they only existed on microfilm, and we had to go to the provincial archives and ask permission, and usually promised them copies of the digital files in exchange for our right to reproduce them on the website. Janet Agenstadt, and I'm forgetting the name of all of her co-authors, they did a fantastic job in their book from a couple of decades ago now, Canada's Founding Debates. It's 500 pages long. It encompasses the 1864 discussions right up to, I believe, PEI joining in 1873. It's 500 pages. They're kind of starting to push the limits of what you can put between two pieces of cardboard.
Yeah.
Our records are, like I said, close to 9,000 pages in total because we, from the outset, preferred a digital format for the primary documents. We were freed from that traditional limitation that historians have faced. And because we were able to encode everything in an XML format, it's created a searchable data set where I can look and say, I want to read everything Sir Charles Tupper said about Confederation from, his early career to his later career. We can do that with the press of a couple buttons.
Right, and sort of I'm looking at it now. You go, the first homepage, or the first thing you're confronted with is a map with a bunch of icons, and you can see what happened in different regions. There's a thing that says enter your postal code, and you can see what your local leaders were saying. That's a really cool idea there. Like you say, the lessons plans are here, the daily quotes, another map where you can look province by province, territory by territory. Really, really fascinating way to think about Confederation and the accessibility of these documents. And you mentioned that you were able to go to the public and have people go through the documents and get them all together. You said that there was a lot of energy behind it. Was that process challenging for you as a historian, as someone who, I know at least for me, as my career has evolved, I always want to be in control of everything. I know there's a recognition that with the number of documents you can't, but even as someone who just studies it and is interested, that you have this desire of, well, these things weren't accessible to me for so long, I just want to see them all.
Yeah, no, I'll confess I haven't read every page. It was really exciting meeting all of these Canadians, not always in person. Sometimes it was only online. But just, getting to be a part of that energy. We had volunteers. I mean, to have that searchable data set you see, we had to identify every individual who speaks in the records. And there was a mother-daughter team who decided to take this on, and they spent quite a lot of time developing what became the data set for that. Knew nothing about it previously. We're just very interested in taking it on.
Which is so cool, right? To have that they just want to do it. And if you look at the About page on the site or the team page,
yes,
this is a extraordinary number of individuals who you have listed here in terms of the transcription team. This is, as close to an army as you could really get.
Yeah. No, it was really fantastic to be a part of it and to get to interact with all these people. And I hope it's something that can be repeated. I mean, Canada 150 and those kinds of major anniversaries don't come along that often. But I've seen LA Library and Archives Canada is starting a public crowdsourced transcription project as well. I hope they experience a similar level of public interest and energy that we did.
Yeah, because you wonder moving forward if with Canada 150 in the rearview mirror now, if some of that energy might go away, and particularly as we start to increase in terms of Second World War anniversaries, if some attention starts to shift. Now, of course, Canada 150 happened within the 100th anniversary of the First World War, and there was still plenty of excitement for it. So it'll be curious to see what happens in that regard. But certainly having this website and this amount of material available is certainly a wonderful place to start. And even for me, I think about when I was an undergraduate student trying to find resources for papers, whatever it was. This sort of thing would have been it would have made my life so much easier.
And we've already been contacted by lawyers, by scholars, students as well, all manners of different professions, walks of life, already engaging the material. Some of it before it was up, they were contacting us saying, "Can we get a sneak peek? Because we really need these records." And I would contact the provincial archive, and they gave me permission, and we'd share what we had. There's a real hunger for it. I mean, if there's one lesson I walked away learning from this, is that Canadians don't necessarily think their history is boring. There's a real appetite for it, and I mean, when it's packaged in a way and it's the right time, it's amazing how much we can surprise ourselves. Maybe.
Yeah, I think that's a really fair point, because when stuff like this comes up, I use the example of Canada People's History. Back when that was made, that was extraordinarily popular. And when it's presented in a format that people want, it's digestible, it's accessible, and it's not dumbed down. I think that's the thing that we make a mistake too often of, is saying that for it to be popular, it has to be quote unquote dumbed down. I think when it's dumbed down, people realize that and say no. And this sort of website is just giving great information and making things accessible, and that's what people want in their history.
Yes.
So let's talk about the book. With the website and the material there, what then prompts the decision to move forth and be the editor of the book? You also have a chapter in here, we should say, in addition to the introduction, but you are the editor of this book. Why would you want to go forward with this project coming off of the website and that material there? Because these are two very different presentations.
Yes. So at an early stage in the Confederation Debates is this public histories project development, we knew there were a lot of Canadians who might be fairly familiar with their own province's history, but maybe not the other end of the country. So we wanted to have some sort of a primer available. We knew we wanted that very early on. So part of when we applied for funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, part of that funding, and then we later were lucky enough to receive funding from the Crabtree Foundation, among many other funding agencies and provincial governments. We knew from a very early stage that we wanted to have that primer available, an accessible but rigorously researched account of each province and territory's entry into Confederation. And then, as I said before, we didn't want to treat Confederation exclusively as a written agreement that leads to the creation of a bunch of provinces and territories. We said Confederation is broader than that. It encompasses Indigenous peoples as well. We are a country of at least 3 founding peoples. So as we stretched the conception of Confederation both temporally to include all of the provinces, including Alberta and Saskatchewan's creation in 1905, yeah, the Yukon before that, and Newfoundland and Labrador is joining after that, and eventually Nunavut. We also wanted to stretch it in terms of the nature of the agreements it encompassed, to include Indigenous peoples as well. To do that well, we convened this conference at St. Jerome's University in February 2016 with many of Canada's leading political historians who were experts on this period and typically of particular provinces. So, Patricia Roy came to speak to British Columbia's entry into Confederation. We had Philip Buckner coming to talk about the Maritimes, Whitney Lackenbauer to talk about the North. And I personally was expecting to get a bunch of chapters with very disparate accounts of what Confederation was and what it didn't do. And what we found was actually we got quite a cohesive story with any prior consultation. And we became very excited by this and said, this really is more deserving of more than just an ebook on a website. This needs to be published. And with Canada 150 coming, we felt there was a strong appetite for it. So we were lucky enough for University of Calgary Press to take it up, and the book proceeded from there.
So when you say that there is a sort of a unified theme to it all and things come together independent of each other, what sort of narrative is created then? Because, as you say, when you look at the subject matter here and you go through the table of contents, you have each province represented. I would just say for my friends from Saskatchewan that you have been paired with Alberta again. From my time out at the University of Regina, I know that I had some people who always complained about being paired with either Alberta or Manitoba. But in this case, it makes sense for the 1905. But each place is different in time, obviously place, local considerations are going to be very different. And it seems to me, as again, someone who's not a expert in Confederation and the various provinces eventually joining into Confederation, that independently, I wouldn't expect there to be a unified narrative to emerge from this.
Yeah, no, and again, in all honesty, I wasn't either. But what we found was that there was a common desire, whether it was, Westerners talking about the creation of Alberta and Saskatchewan, or Ontario or Quebecers talking about, their entry into Confederation, or Maritimers. There was a common desire for inclusion. This includes Indigenous peoples, and those advocating signing the treaty were also pursuing a continued relationship with the Crown. There's a desire for inclusion in this new thing called Canada, and for that to be represented and to have a stake in it, while also pursuing the protection of local autonomy. Now, the degree of local autonomy, the nature of it, those visions varied dramatically. And that's where, the debates ensued. And we see different manifestations of it. But whether you're an indigenous chief advocating signing a treaty, whether you were, somebody out west or out east or even in central Canada advocating joining Canada, there was this desire to preserve a degree of local autonomy, but also be included in this larger country that was, evolving.
But certainly that has to change over time too, though, right? Because when you have those first 4 provinces coming together in 67, that's a very different prospect than what happens with Newfoundland in the middle of the century, right? Because Newfoundland's coming in for different reasons. They know what Canada is, how it functions. When you have those first 4, they're to a certain extent flying blind and not really knowing what to expect.
That's true, but the BNA Act included measures for acquisition of the Northwest. There was anticipation that British Columbia would be invited to join. Newfoundland and Labrador and Prince Edward Island don't join, but they were part of the discussion, and the whole expectation was, somehow eventually this will happen. And to your point, Newfoundland and Labrador's discussion, and Raymond Blake does a very good job in his chapter on Newfoundland and Labrador discussing this. Yes, in the 1860s, we don't have the welfare state. In the 1940s, we do. And that is obviously very important to Joey Smallwood's argument about how Newfoundland and Labrador are going to come in. Having said that, when you look at, let's say, the anti-Confederate view in Newfoundland and Labrador in the 1860s and the 1940s, there is a common concern whether Newfoundland will have any voice in Parliament, because representation by population, as a percentage of Canada's national population, Newfoundland is not a very big number. So there's concern about that, and there's concern about whether Newfoundland's trade policies are going to be impacted because of the nature of the trade that they have in fisheries and margarine and other things at the time. The debates in terms of that kind of representation and minority rights don't actually differ that much in subject and content, perhaps, but not in tone and not in principle.
That really speaks then to basically the universality of these types of issues in Canadian history.
Yeah, majority rule and minority rights are a common thread in many countries' histories.
Right.
And we're a federation, so there's a perennial debate about how much local autonomy there should be. Obviously, when the country is being founded in the 1860s, these things are being invented as they go. But that invention didn't stop. As you say, you come from at least an education background from the prairies. And as an Ontarian, I'd be remiss if I didn't point out that, Alberta and Saskatchewan and indeed Manitoba don't get full provincial rights when they're established.
Right.
And there's some extremely heated debates. Some of the longest debates in parliamentary history occur over language rights on the prairies and natural resource and crown land rights on the prairies. And the fact that in Ontario or Quebec or the Maritimes, they had control of crown lands and they had control of natural resources, and language varied from province to province. These debates about the nature of how that autonomy is created aren't limited to any particular province. And again, the same goes for Indigenous peoples. And as they're negotiating these treaties, there is obviously real concern about the degree of local autonomy they will have. And in some cases, they negotiated very well. Now, we know, once the Indian Act is enacted and amended as many times as it is, that autonomy was grossly abused. But when we look at it from a foundational perspective and what was agreed to, there is a common thread.
So in looking at them then, or in looking at the book as a whole, so essentially what has been created here is case studies that examine a central thread. Would that be fair to look at it in that way?
I would say that's one thing the book does, definitely. It does more than that as well. I mean, we took a page out of Jed Martin's book where he's done, along with many other scholars, a really good job of exploring the anti-view and giving voice to those who opposed their province joining and raised at times very prescient concerns, very legitimate concerns about, how is this going to work out? How is my province or territory going to be served by the agreement that is on the table?
So how do we then put that into an understanding of contemporary issues related to either independence and or identity or identities? Because obviously this speaks to local identity, whether it's provincial or regional, whatever it is. And on top of that, then we have the concept of a Canadian nationalism. And it strikes me then that if we're looking at these debates and concerns over local rights, all that sort of how do we manufacture a system in which everybody is represented and there is some level of voice granted to each person or each province, whatever it is, how then do we understand the effect that has on a broader nationalism and national identity that starts to emerge once we have a political entity known as Canada?
Ooh, big questions.
I know, that's really broad, but
no.
It strikes me as sort of a central issue that would have to be addressed in this book.
Yes. So in terms of your first part of the question, in terms of understanding these identities and independence, what we're hoping the book does is, as it was originally conceived, even before we expected it to become a book, was to help Canadians gain a greater understanding of these different identities and perspectives and expectations of Canada that continue to inform us to the present day, be they Indigenous expectations of treaties, be they Western expectations of voice in Parliament and provincial rights, be they language rights in Quebec, to understand where these foundational beliefs came from. And those foundational beliefs, in many cases, are voiced initially by the anti-Confederate views, if we can call them. Sometimes they were actually opposed to Confederation. Sometimes they were not opposed to Confederation, but didn't like the particular deal on the table. It varies. But the point is their concerns often became rallying points later on, in subsequent years or decades, to say, somebody saw this coming. To understand the roots of those grievances or expectations, or indeed successes, where the pro side said, no, it's going to go this way, and indeed it did. Right. To understand how these beliefs and expectations formed is, I think, critical to what the book is attempting to do, and what we hope it will help Canadians do as they learn more about the expectations of different parts of the country, where those expectations perhaps differ from what they have been led to assume Canada must inherently be built to do.
But do those expectations that people had at the time, do they alter what Canada was essentially built to do? And do the expectations of people at the time, how should they influence how we think of those debates now? Or maybe not even debates, how we understand the state of the country and the political union amongst all these provinces and territories.
So my hope is, and I'm speaking as an Ontarian, and I mean, we believe we're the center of the universe, and that's long-standing. That has roots going right back to Confederation in the 1860s. So I personally grew up with a very Ontarian perspective of what Canada should be. In fact, what is an Ontarian? It's not a word. If you type it into a word processor, it's going to say misspelling. We're Canadians in Ontario, right? Whereas that's very unique to Ontario, and perhaps not, in other parts of the country, there's stronger regional identities or provincial identities or sub-regional identities. And my hope is that this book can help create that fluency to introduce Canadians to other ways of thinking about and indeed being Canadian. And that when we think about nationalism, then my hope is that, as we create this fluency, Canada is a federation. It's not a legislative union, it's a federation. From the outset, we understood that there were going to be pretty significant differences of opinion in terms of what the purpose of Canada was, and in terms of the more day-to-day nature of things, the decisions that get made. There's going to be differences of opinion on what should be done as we build a railway out to the prairies, or we're deciding conscription or other policy. It was understood we're a federation because there are going to be these differences of opinion, and they're going to be separated to some extent geographically. So we create this federation, and I like Ronald Watts, the late political scientist and real world-leading expert in federalism. He says that federations are an effective way, a practical way of combining unity and diversity. So to me, to try, as many people have throughout Canadian history, to say what is Canadian nationalism and to find a single ism is not what I'm hoping this book does. What I'm hoping it does instead is helps us to accept the fact that we're probably not going to agree on everything completely, but that the common pursuit of this inclusion is still worthwhile and indeed has been workable for 150 years.
With some exceptions, right?
There's been national unity crises. We've had referendums, some of which have been quite close.
Right.
Even Newfoundland, when it joins Confederation, it joins by a similarly very narrow margin. So yes, of course, there are the desire for inclusion has ebbed and flowed over time. I'm not saying that it hasn't, but what I'm saying is that is common. Overall.
Which I definitely think that is a very fair assessment to make with this book, and just overall, just in general, sort of an assessment of Confederation. And I always tell my students whenever it comes up, which isn't that often given what it is that I teach, that Canada, the debate around Canada 150 and how old this country actually is.
Yes,
I would always say that the political union that we understand as Canada is 150 years old. And as long as we can continue to understand that when we say the word Canada as a nation, we recognize that it is this political entity, and it's not necessarily tied to the borders, or maybe it is tied to the borders, but the land itself, which of course is much older, and the people who have inhabited it are much older than the 150. And as long as we can understand that conception of it, it's central to a variety of things, including truth and reconciliation, and just, I think, a better understanding of the country we live in today and the political debates and things that are going on. If you look at the cannabis thing, for instance, how each province gets to figure out how they're going to roll out in their province. That is a result of what happened with these debates.
That's right. And I mean, during Canada 150, with both projects, the book project and the larger public history project, it was really fascinating to watch the debate and indeed receive some criticism saying, Confederation Debates is, too celebratory. And then the next day we'd post an anti-Confederation quote and somebody else would say, we're too negative. Went back and forth, endlessly. And our goal was, and this book's goal, is to be neither celebratory nor overly critical. That's not the best way of putting it, but maybe even cynical of Confederation, to say what we're trying to do instead is promote understanding and to promote new ways of thinking that encourage reconciliation and just interregional or interprovincial understanding.
Yeah, and that's, I think, what understanding Confederation should be. Right? It shouldn't be necessarily laudatory, or it shouldn't be condemning. It should just be trying to understand what happened, why it happened, and then how it influences us today in terms of these larger, broad issues that we've talked about so far, and that aren't going away anytime soon.
No.
Yeah. So if you look at the book, you mentioned some of the names already, but it is a bit of a murderer's row of Canadian political history here. You got J.R. Miller. You mentioned that you had from the University of Regina, one of my old professors, Raymond Blake. Patricia Roy is in this, Philip Buckner, Marcel Martel, yourself. You have Whitney Lackenbauer, who a lot of people would be familiar with, who listened to this show, Barry Ferguson as well. So this really is a very solid group that you've put together. Bill Weiser as well. I can't forget Bill Weiser. So a really solid group, and a book then that you would expect, as you say, to have very good rigor, but knowing and having read a lot of these people, also something that would be fun just to pick up and read. That's
exactly the goal, yes. And I'm hoping we've achieved it.
Yeah, hopefully. So definitely encourage everybody to pick it up. Again, it is Reconsidering Confederation, Canada's Founding Debates, 1864 to 1999. And that is from our friends out at the University of Calgary Press. You can also go to the Confederation Debates website, which we would definitely encourage you to do. It is hcmc.uvic.ca/Confederation. It's available in both languages as well, which is pretty cool. You don't necessarily expect to see too much stuff like this in terms of primary use and all that kind of stuff to have it be in both languages, but obviously, in addition to the transcriptions, finding the documents, everything else, the scanning, the translation of this, a huge amount of work has gone into this.
I'll confess, not all of the records are translated. Probably about a sixth of it is translated.
That's still way more than I would have expected in terms of archival records, right? So I think that's a tremendous thing, and definitely check it out. You can see what happened in your neck of the woods during the Confederation debates in your area, and a lot of really interesting material here. So we would encourage everybody to check all of that out, and we definitely would like to thank Dan Heidt for coming on the show today. Dan, thank you so much.
Thank you for the invitation.
If you have any questions or comments for the show, you can find us at historyslam@gmail.com. I am at Dr. Shawnee Fever on Twitter. If you have not yet, please do subscribe to the show on Google Play, on Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your show. Give us the likes, ratings, all that fun stuff to keep the show going. And we'll be back in a couple weeks with a new episode. But until then, if you're out and you see Enrico Palazzo, please say hi for me.
Thanks for listening to the History Slam podcast. Be sure to check out Active History for more features, articles, and be sure to subscribe on iTunes.